Welcome, everyone. My name is Brian Brown, and I have the privilege of serving as the chair this year for the program on race, inequality, language, and education here at Stanford's Graduate School of Education. We have lost a lot in the last 2 years, but one of the things that COVID has not been able to take from us is the building of an incredible community. And I'm excited today that we'll be able to share in the work of one of our newest and most incredible colleagues. And so we're going to really enjoy what we get an opportunity to learn today. I'm going to ask that you join in discussing and sharing the ideas that you're going to learn about today using the RILE 2022 hashtag on Twitter. And so we want to make sure people get an opportunity to share and learn with us today. So make sure you communicate what you're thinking through that venue. We'll save time in the end for questions. So make sure if you have questions, you use the question and answer function accordingly. To provide our speaker with the appropriate introduction, we are going to have one of our incredible graduate students serve as a moderator. So today, Jaylen Pittman will serve as your moderator. Jaylen Pittman is a PhD student at Stanford University, where he concentrates on learning sciences, technology, design, and developmental psychological sciences. He's a member of the Black Developmental Lab and Educational Neuroscience Initiative. Jaylen's research employs theories and methods from linguistics, neuroscience, psychology, and artificial intelligence. His current work takes evaluative approaches to documenting and investigating linguistic biases in large language models, with a particular focus on representation of Black names in language models. As a trained linguist, Jaylen earned his bachelor's and master's degree in linguistics from Yale University and at University of California, Santa Barbara, respectively. He has won the inaugural Technology and Racial Equity Fellow at Stanford, where he works on equity-based approaches to social technical AI. So Jaylen, we appreciate you serving today. Welcome, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm going to be moderating and taking questions and looking through the chat. But before I do so, I would like to welcome our distinguished guests. My advisor, Professor Ann Charity Hudley is a professor of education at Stanford and professor of African American Studies and Linguistics by courtesy at Stanford. She's affiliated with the Center for Comparative Race and Ethnicity and the Symbolic Systems Program. Her research and publications address the relationship between language variation and educational practices and policies from preschool to graduate school, with a focus on high impact practices for underrepresented students in higher education. Professor Charity Hudley is the co-author of 3 books that are currently out: The Indispensable Guide to Undergraduate Research, We Do Language, and Understanding English Language Variation in US Schools. Her 4th book, Talking College, will appear in the spring of 2022 and is currently available for pre-order with Teacher College Press and select resale vendors. Professor Charity Hudley's journal publications have appeared in many forms and in many destinations, including Language, the Journal of English Linguistics, Child Development, Language Variation and Change, American Speech, the list goes on. In addition, she is in many book collections, including the Handbook of African American Psychology, Ethno-Linguistic Diversity and Literacy Education, Oxford Handbook of Sociolinguistics, and Oxford Handbook of Language and Society. To add to this, she's been an invited speaker for numerous keynotes and academic meetings, and she provides lectures and workshops for K-12 teachers, while also generously contributing to community initiatives and public intellectual work. Her significant contributions to the field have been recognized with the Public Engagement Award from the Society for Linguistic Anthropology, an award for the Linguistic Society of America, and funding from the NIH, the NSF, the Mellon Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and others. Professor Charity Hudley has served on the Executive Committee of the Linguistic Society of America, the Standing Committee on Research of the National Council of Teachers of English, and as a consultant to the National Research Council Committee on Language and Education, in addition to being on steering committees and such as the NSF's Committee on Broadening Participation in Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics. In addition, this past year, Professor Charity Hudley was named a 2021 Fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Sciences. She was recognized for, and I quote, distinguished contributions to addressing issues of social justice and linguistics and beyond, particularly in the African American context. Without further ado, please join me in providing a warm welcome to Professor and Charity Hudley.
Thank you so much, Jaylen, for the generous introduction. It has been an honor and privilege to enter Stanford with you this fall. And I'm just so grateful for everyone who is watching this talk live. I welcome a lively chat. I may not see it as I go, but I'll see it at the end in a Q&A. So I welcome you to think and ask questions as we go along. And I welcome those who are not watching live. You are more than welcome to email me, message me on Twitter, tweet about whatever. The feedback, the conversation that I'm hoping for today is real. What I'm going to be talking about is really models that have to happen finally after all these years of challenge and struggle. I love thinking about this in the context of Black History Month for Black linguistic and cultural reparations. And so our new lab here, the Black Academic Lab, known as the BAD Lab, has been working on this Talking College project since we started back at the College of William and Mary through UC Santa Barbara and until today. We put it in the context of our lived lives. And Audre Lorde talks about this so directly. She says, I want to live the rest of my life, however long or short, with as much sweetness as I can decently manage, loving all the people I love and doing as much as I can do of the work I still have to do. I am going to write fire until it comes out of my ears, my eyes, my nose holes, everywhere until it's every breath I breathe. I'm going to go out like a fucking meteor. As many of you all know, as soon as I arrived here at Stanford, with all intents and wonders in the world, I was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic brain cancer. Following Audre Lorde's model, this work and the culmination of finishing it is a conversation of how we as scholars, Black scholars in the academy, but in these predominantly white contexts, in our HBCU context, in the UC and Hispanic serving and African American, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Native context, how do we in these places go out like fucking meteors? And so the Talking College team has come to this work with that lens in mind. And so this is a pictorial representation of many of the scholars who have participated in this work as co-designers of the work, co-researchers, data collectors, analysts, curriculum creators, educators, K-12, higher ed, professors, and now the conversation from the book launch conversation is really how do we work together and what do we do next? So I really see this as an invitation in to this large conversation rather than just a report out. Lucille Clifton asked us to think about this quite tangibly as a celebration. How do we celebrate something that every day has tried to kill us, but has failed? The documentation of that, the process of that is the work that I'm talking about today. And so specifically here at Stanford, our conversation can really be about how do we talk college at private, truly super elite universities. And this is not the only place where this conversation is active. I have photographic representation of these conversations that I've been having in my other trips to Stanford. Here's some at MIT, at Penn. All through the pandemic, I've been going virtually as people responded to pandemics and to protests to have these conversations. So today I'm here with you, but tomorrow, for example, I'm virtually at McGill. This conversation's happened at University of Toronto. I'm at Harvard next month. We're going everywhere that we can and saying, look, racial justice and linguistic justice have to be part of these conversations. And so we're bringing all of our best sentiments from sociolinguistics, but we're bringing also all of our best sentiments from multicultural education, culturally sustaining pedagogies, and pedagogies of fugitivity, of abolition, and liberation. There are precursors in linguistics to this model. My own dissertation advisor, William Labov, set this path for me quite distinctly in saying that an investigator who has obtained linguistic data from members of a speech community has an obligation to use that knowledge for the benefit of that community when it has need of it. Tying that together with one of my other mentors, Walt Wolfram, who says investigators should actively pursue ways in which they can return linguistic information, along with concepts from John Rickford, who really argued that American quantitative sociolinguistics, that gave me my start and my framework, has relatively given little back to the community of Black scholars from which it has so richly drawn. And so I really do see reparations as the logical current extension of this, is that we need to actively and explicitly recognize the material and intellectual profit from the linguistic value of Black communities and how that's mostly represented in the linguistics world through the Black college students and faculty and staff members that are immediately present around the linguists who have done and benefited from this work. And that's really how Talking College got started. So we use this to really underscore our desire for a community-based participatory research methodology that is immediate in results. I'm talking about my education scholars, my linguists who are becoming policymakers, including Jamal Muakil, who worked tirelessly on this project while serving as the UC regent. I'm looking at my students, including Tracy Connor, Mackenzie Fama, Hannah Franz, who are students who are faculty, right, who have walked this experience and journey across. And the whole time that we're thinking about this in terms of attentiveness to community needs and culture, we are asking our students and ourselves, who is it that we are trying to be? So we have to address this in the framework of inclusion challenges. Most of the research that kind of allows us to be in places and spaces like this follows from a National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health inclusion model. We broaden participation, we do inclusion, but it is largely assimilatory, right? I'm looking for people who do my modeling. I'm looking for people who are incrementally asking the next questions in my model, because I understand structurally and economically, that's what keeps the money flowing and the wheels turning. And that is real. There is no point in my career where I have not benefited from substantial funding, particularly from the National Science Foundation. But as we work in that model, we want to think about partnerships. What are neighboring areas of research, especially racial, ethnic, and gender studies programs? How are they functioning and moving in these spaces? And how can we work to support them as we think of new paradigms to address inclusion across this STEM and this partnership model? And as we do that, we want to emphasize social justice and the intellectual value of scholars presently in linguistics, presently in education, but also really thinking about those who were silenced or de-emphasized in really critical ways. And so we bring that really materially into our citation list in this project. So Mary Buckles, Christine Mountain, and I had a set of papers come out in Language, the Journal of the Linguistic Society of America, that really thought about this issue from the lens of race. But in the Talking College project, we really are thinking about it in the terms of our positionality and our identity and how we kind of move through these spaces of inclusion and race and sexuality and intersectionality, and thinking about where we find ourselves on this kind of schema that we lay our identities, our bodies, our language on top of. And so we have graduate students, newer professors, super progressive scholars out here who are teaching, researching, serving for justice. We got vulnerable faculty, people with pre-tenure, and people who are going to have issues in the ways that they are reviewed and seen. And there's always an issue that can be found, especially if you're a Black woman moving through the academy. And so that's something that we bring to bear in this model. We got faculty out here who are happy to have a job and do what they do. And some of the questions in the intersections there is, how is discrimination and inappropriate behavior even handled? Especially when a lot of the challenges we see result from lazy and willful ignorance. Many of these people who contest these issues are forced out or weeded out of these conversations about Talking College because they aren't given faculty positions, or they may choose to leave the academy. And up against that same parallel, there are people who are really out here vested in thinking that they are smart. Mary, Christine, and I see us actively in the middle of this world, trying to make sense of how to place this higher ed research in this model. And at the bottom of the model, we have people who are altering the route to faculty and other positions. We have faculty who are able to monetize their careers. They have real reasons to defend their elite status, so they're top of the heat power dynamic. And as we look at those scholars, we really are cautious of those who are jockeying for elite status by adopting progressive causes. This is not a challenge outward, we're arguing. This is also a challenge inward to us to make sense of what we are doing in this work. So that's the structural reality under which we see our work looking at the Black experience in education going across the lifespan. So we started, my dissertation was materially on pre-kindergarten, first grade students. Moving on up the school situation, taking a detour to focus on undergraduate research, because if I can't bring my Black students along with me, whatever is this for, and on to talking college. That'll be the bulk of what I talk about today. So it'll be out April 1st, and I'm going to just give you a general overview. I will forever have the identity of being a Black lady in an English department. So a book talk there is a very different genre than you might think of in the School of Education. So I'm mixing it up a little bit. The first is just thinking about, why does Black language matter? Why, of all the things that we're going to stake our claims and spend our energy on, why is that important? And so we lay out our ideas about that in chapter 1. In chapter 2, we talk about the long trajectory of the fights and just struggle to have students to have the right to their own language. And we talk about organizations and our own perspectives on why thinking of that as a struggle for rights is still important. In chapter 3, we really focus in on what are we talking about when we're talking about African American English. And this chapter is really informed by the research model of having our students highlight the things that they were most interested about the language, about the culture, things that had impacted them across their educational experience, but particularly in higher education. In chapter 4, we really then dig deep into ethnographic and interview-based material from college students all across the United States to formulate a model that drives us into chapter 5 of what will have to happen as we imagine and make practical a reality for having the next generation of linguistic dream keepers, following Gloria Ladson-Billings's model of dream keeping as a way of not just living your life, but of pedagogy, practice, and research design. Why it's important to set it up like this, we say, is because we want to bring scholars into the academy through the process of doing this work. And so our partnerships with faculty and graduate students and undergraduates at the UC, at historically Black colleges and universities, and colleges around are super important. We have a summer program that teaches courses and examines the roles of language and mobility. And we are super excited to have brought that program and be welcoming our first cohort of students to Stanford this summer. So these findings benefit the program and the design and the ways that we think about inclusion, but it gives us rich material and empirical information about the language and culture of Black college students, which has then that cyclical direct implication for teaching and mentoring. Super important to this project is the education of graduate students and educating in the way that we can create a more diverse model for faculty, particularly for faculty in STEM and other areas that the National Science Foundation funds. And so this research has a focus on pedagogical training. It has a focus on reimagining graduate education and faculty and career mentoring, so I can prepare our students to work wherever they're interested. If it's an R1, fantastic. If it's a research university and regional, awesome. If it's a historically Black college, wonderful. If it's a community college, fantastic. We want to make sure you have those interests, you understand what you may be able to engage in, and we then need to contend with our relationships with our Black faculty and graduate students and imagine the worlds that they want to enter, not just the ones that we may privilege in our own experiences. So the questions lead to this: how does the acquisition of different varieties of Black language and culture overlap with identity development, particularly intersectional racial identity development? So this is a huge undertaking. Before the pandemic, we were going in person to campuses, doing ethnographies in real time and space. Kendra and some of the graduate students were teaching at other universities, including HBCUs. Our students were interviewing in person, and then when the pandemic hit, we switched it all to Zoom. And so we really couldn't do this work without the large partnership model and the large numbers of students involved. And so that's why we use a framework of deserving, because this work is for the students who did the work. And we are now in dissemination mode. And Maya Hayes, one of our amazing students from Norfolk State, they said it best. Just imagine if more Black students had the information is our research model. Along with that is the model of thinking about why do we do research? And the specificity of the answer is what matters. So as we work to make undergraduate education inclusive, we have to examine who we are educating as part of that. And educators who are researching language have to adopt this framework of thinking about who is in their classrooms and the justice aspects of that for their materials and their findings to be relevant and replicable to a larger population. So no small secret, my true joy of being here at Stanford is because two of my nieces are undergraduates here. And our lens on how we see Stanford education, how we see Stanford arts and letters and sciences, how we see Stanford engineering, how my husband is seeing Stanford medicine. That's part of the work, because in the Black tradition, the family is the heart of community. Community is the art of practice, and practice is the art of our action. So students' right to their own language gives us a framework to thinking about the right of students to use their own language as something that's super important to this project. It was first passed in 1972. It's been reaffirmed and reimagined. This critical source book is super important to this project. And the aspects of that then lead us to do more humanistic social science research, as my students are working with me in our community-based methods course right now, to design innovative pedagogy, following the models that we've gotten from multicultural education and culture sustaining pedagogy, but then combining those with the scholarship of teaching and learning, thinking about who actively needs to be in dialogue with us institutionally, individuals, scholars, administrators, so that our partnerships can grow and expand. So these are our active aspects to the model that we will now be able to use the text to have just a starting place as we continue the work. What do students deserve to know? They deserve to know that African American English is a thing. And we richly describe in the text the transformational experience that students have once they know that their language is worthy of study, of praise, of learning in a heritage language model, of sharing in an educational model. And how we do that is knowing how African American English looks and sounds like in spoken form, but in written form, but also in signed form. We have a brilliant vignette from Joseph Hill, who's a deaf linguist, who really talks about the first time he realized that African American English, Black ASL, was a thing that he could study and do. And we understand how African American English impacts a given curriculum and praxis. So our major examples in the text are thinking about writing and the impact that having this knowledge has as students advocate for the rights to their own language actively with their writing instructors. Students deserve to know that their language is beautiful. We will not shy away from the aesthetic aspect of this. We won't be pressed into one of just educational attainment or inequality or things that people may call the education gap. This is about values. This is about symbols, interpretations, and perspectives, and the way that we scholarly depict and describe them. Students deserve to know that all languages have value. They deserve to know that African American language, Black language, and culture is part of the ways that language functions, and so that their language isn't broken, but they're not broken either. And so students would come to us thinking about these rhetorics. They've heard about broken English, their language not being up to par in general, and talked richly and deeply about what that did to their own identity, their own sense of self, and their own sense of who they were trying to be and how they presented themselves to the world. We did get into linguistic details, especially in chapter 3, really showing how variable African American English is. When we use that term as an umbrella term to really show different cultural, historical, but also emerging patterns of the language. And so helping students really understand that is super important to us as we focus on this question of, well, what is it? Can we understand other people if we're speaking African American English? Is it related to English? Is it a different language? Is it a different variety? And saying people are going to vary on that. People are going to have different opinions. You're going to have different opinions. Different scholars are going to have different opinions. And that's part of the approach? Why do we all care about it? Why do we still use it? Is where we come in and say it's so that we can preserve meaning. We preserve meaning and culture through this. So however technically you want to just depict it, that's great. But understanding the value underneath it is really what we focus in on in chapter 3. We want students to understand that their linguistic, their rhetorical, and their cultural practices have power. And it's the language of like activism that we're capturing in the text and the impact of our communication to change our own experiences, to really think strategically about how that can happen across your undergraduate and graduate years, and how can you use your communicative practices to make the types of changes that you'd like to see. And really important to our model and building on previous work but expanding is the concept that our Black does not have to sound like somebody else's. And so we go deep into the research of showing the variation within African American English linguistically, but culturally and experientially as part of this practice. So when we get into chapter 4, we really have a focus on the impact of this, all of this on college students' experiences. So we built a model to just allow us to have these conversations. So we really see it as a dissemination model rather than a fixed model, meaning our students will now start to work on this more. They'll add empirical aspects of it, computational aspects of it. They will increase the ethnographic range of the work, hopefully post-pandemic in the coming months. But what's key to this is that we want to engage students right when they're starting to feel that set of social pressures as they find new freedoms to say, well, what is Blackness? What does it mean to be Black? How can I express it? How is Blackness acquired? How is it socialized? And in some instances, especially in college campuses, how is it performed? And so how does that then overlap with how students navigate their identities as they decide, many often for the first time in more free situation, their own gender identity, their sexual orientation, as they think about how they want to contend with social class and mobility. And at the same time, they're contending with acquisition. So many of us where we learn to speak is what we speak. And so the example I always give is, I may want to sound Black all day, but I went to a white K-12 environment. And so it may have rendered me sounding white to some people, whether I wanted to or not necessarily to the kids in that school, believe that. So I'm constantly all day long making choices about my racial identity and performance, right? So engaging people in that sense of their own linguistic autobiography and history is key to the model in practice. So we built the model around the idea is that it's fluid, it's not fixed, and it's meant to be fleshed out and described with students in real time. And so we have students in the model who see themselves in the model and others who keep adding to it. And that was a beautiful part of the process. We have students who are grappling with standardized English, and they know it when they get to college. It may be in written form, it may be in spoken form. And they know that they speak African American English in some variety. We have students who speak African American English and are unbothered. They understand the political and social backdrop of their language, and they've made that choice. And they're dealing with that in their own different ways, and that's what's richly described in the text. We have students who are amazing users of African American English and who are amazing at standardized English. Those students really have that mastery. They know how to use their language in ways that benefit themselves and often others, given their linguistic repertoire. And we have students who speak standardized English and speak some African American English or understand it, right? This is our heritage language speakers, particularly from parents or community members, but their own educational experience may have varied some from their cultural background. So that students describing that linguistic difference, but also how they got to that place was super important. And we have students who speak standardized English and know African American English, but they ain't really trying to admit it. And this could be for different reasons. Sometimes it's because they really say, I don't know about this whole African American English thing. I speak English and this is just how it is. Others are really not trying to lead forward with racial cultural identity. And so they have other descriptors. And what we're doing is we're valuing that and we're looking at that process. And then we have students who speak standardized English and don't know African American English, right? And they may be really interested in learning, and sometimes they come to my classes with that lens. So Doza, one of our awesome doctoral students at UC Santa Barbara, really did this graphic to show that the model that we've created is not linear and it's not static, and students may move through this through time and space across their lifespan, but you may move this way through different linguistic features in an acquisitional sense, meaning there may be some features that you are really tied to using and portraying and negotiating to show your Blackness. And there are other linguistic features that, you know what, you may not even notice or think about as salient to your identity or your presentation. And so the model has dimensions in both ways, because we don't feel the same about all different linguistic features, nor that we have the same acquisitional repertoire across those linguistic features, right? I'll just give you a couple of examples. The text is rich, and the data set that I'm inviting you all into thinking about analyzing even further with me is super rich. And so here's one that just thinks about students who speak African American English and are still grappling with standardized English and know it. This is an example from a transfer student who really sees their ability to acquire standardized English as part of their transferability identity. So the student says, I try to tell them I speak in a certain way to demonstrate like I can transfer. Is listen to me, right? And so how they sound, their identity as a scholar, and their identity to manipulate and change that variety based on their scholarly identity is all part of how they're grappling with this socially, racially, and culturally. Other students, if they're grappling with standardized English, may not even know what they're doing is African American English, and the concept may be new to them. So they just think they are bad with language, or they're bad with learning college language, and their concept of Blackness may be pronounced. They just see these two aspects of divorce as divorced. So you're the student here that just says, oh, wait, what? That's African American English, right? They're saying, I didn't even know. I just thought that was, people were just saying that's how I talked, and it was a little interesting or not really for college. And so we're bringing that racial, cultural history and legacy and identity to them in this discussion. Other students who speak African American English and are unbothered, lay it out. They're proud of their language. They're oppositional to dominant structures, but they understand that college is about graduation, right? So their concept of Blackness may be pronounced. The student says someone who believes in the politics of academia, someone who really believes this is going to change my life, or this is going to help the world. You know what I'm saying? They're going to make strategic decisions, but they understand that the Blackness aspect, how they are going to get treated, they could change all the language in the world, and that may not change, right? And so the student is really saying, you realize that there are limits to what comes out of your mouth versus how you look, your history, and I'm trying to navigate all of that in a way. But when I write my essays, I do write them in a way that's grammatically correct, right? So they are really clear in understanding what they have to do to move through the process, but how complicated that navigation is on a daily basis. Just do one more just to give you an illustration here. We had participants on the project, as well as people who we interviewed and really worked with on campuses from across the Black diaspora. And they really richly described the process and the identity process of becoming seen as Black or African American in the US context, and how that also impacted their relationship with African American English. So here's a student who just says, well, if I'm with my friends, I'll use more slang. Or if I'm with like different types of people, I'd say like more certain kinds of slang. Like if I'm with my friends, like my Black slang is a little different than if I was with my non-Black friends, right? So they are understanding that diasporic identity aspect. And then another student from the diaspora said, I feel like there's just a whole subset of slang that like Black people use or start before it comes like general slang that everyone uses. So I feel like I might be using those kind of words with Black friends before they maybe even become like what everyone else uses, right? So they're thinking about that relationship to how they position themselves across their different friend groups as they acquire sometimes these new identities. We had graduate students in the study as well. And this is a graduate student from the Black diaspora at another super elite university, just like Stanford, who talks about this in terms of the developmental aspects. And the student says, if you had interviewed me right out of college, I don't know would I have said the same things I'm saying right now. I think the biggest way it's affected me is made me realize that people aren't safe. To develop relationships that are trusting and vulnerable. And the student talks about this in terms of how do they decide how to present themselves, what varieties to use and what varieties to say in the context of how graduate school is set up. And the student says that, like, I'm not going to talk to you about why it's so difficult for me to feel like I have to prove myself in every classroom, because in many of them, I'm one or two in a lot of situations being pulled, one Black woman in these spaces. And I know I'm being judged for how I talk and how I dress and my research agenda and my methodology. So the students are super conscious about how their sense of how they're seen as a scholar, their potential for their future overlaps with this presentation of race, language, and self. And the choice making of that is constant and in real time. So what we are saying is we need to bring this rich information into broader conversations of the teaching and learning of Black students in undergraduate experiences and in graduate experiences. And we need to think about our jobs, those of us who identify as Black scholars, but those of us who identify broadly. So this is not a list just for you all, it's also a list for myself of thinking about how has this information informed me as a scholar, but also as an educator. I think about how it's informed my job. My job is to compel my students to dream bigger than the current limits of educational and linguistic white supremacy. My job is to make sure they're not grateful for crumbs that are results of current practices. And my job is to center their Blackness at all times in our research to give them license to do so. And my job is to really help center my scholars in the experience in the academy overall. And I think about this so pertinently due to the amazing cohort of Black students that we have here at Stanford right now, who are thinking with me about this work and working on this data and allowing us to ask questions and add nuance that we could never do if it was one or two Black students alone. And that's why liberation for me has been so much a part of this project. We are designing not just a study, but we are designing a linguistics for people from marginalized and racialized communities that's way more focused on liberating our forms of communication, our forms of expression, and then in that sense, our intellectual forms of human connection. So out of that came a question of why would we ever work in a community where we are not actively working to include members of those communities, not just in the research, not just in the community-based participatory findings, but in our own universities, in our departments, in our research areas. And we say, you know, how different this work really is because we included people at every step, thinking that they too could be students at Stanford, thinking too that they could be professors here as part of the design. And so what we need to work on next, I say, as linguists and educators, is how we take this information into our classes and into our conversations, and how this will really change how we support Black students in higher education and tailor our information from it. And so it's not just on the students. In our classes, we want to think about what we're doing. We want to think about the languages and the varieties that we are welcoming as students do their work, whether they're engaging with this in class, how they're doing their writing, their speaking, their science. We're thinking about our own use of languages and our own understandings of African-American language as part of that process. And we're thinking about the diverse pool of scholars that we can assign and the range of students and faculty we can engage with in our research to make sure that that research is good science, that it's good, it's replicable, it's applicable to different populations. So we're doing that. We've created a guide to writing that students can use to advocate for the rights of their own language, but also really has explicit information for educators. Shows what features of African-American English we know from our empirical work are most used in college student writing. We provide questions for instructors to ask to understand if students want to advocate for their right to their own language, and to understand if they're going for standardized English, a mix, African-American English. We have sample papers on the website, sample rubrics right? Ways that you can think about this in a more anti-racist and equitable framework for thinking about writing evaluation. And we give examples of African-American English use across genres, academic writing, creative writing, literary, media, so that we can really start this active practice of using this information in context in classrooms. So the website for that is srtow.org. That's students' rights to their own writing.org. And it's really laid out graphically, accessibly, things that you can do, bringing culturally sustaining approaches into higher education rather than traditional approaches that have been pragmatic or shorthand or just kind of accepted, so that we can start to think about rewarding linguistic flexibility rather than just rewarding linguistic assimilation. Kendra Calhoun is now a postdoctoral fellow at UCLA in anthropology. And Kendra used the information and the materials from this project to design a Black-centered linguistics course. The course is really designed to teach about language and linguistics broadly, both on conventional interactions, but also on social media. And the course had a real focus on language, race, and identity, particularly in pop culture and higher education. She really centered Blackness through the whole course. So we're really thinking about this would be an intro linguistics course appropriate for any linguistics department in the country, but also for Black studies and African American studies departments. And we really challenged core notions of what would be in an intro linguistics course and really forefronted Black students' own questions and their own lived experiences based on the materials that we collected, but also of the students in the course. The paper that is related to this work is called Attracting Black Students to Linguistics Through a Black-Centered Introduction to Linguistics. And we were really excited when we won last year's best paper in language because of this work. It's richly empirically driven, but also really community-centered. So our next steps, working with one of our own Ryle graduates, Quentin Sedlacek, who's now at Southern Methodist, is to think about how we are going to infuse this information across more programs in education. We just completed a huge survey of who is talking about African American language and culture in courses across education, linguistics, anthropology, writing. We have lots of data. It's a whole nother talk, so that we can make a real strategy for infusing this information across curriculums. We got the team to do it. We are funded to really now go from talking college to talking faculty. We're going to examine how Black faculty really navigate their own linguistic experiences, both in their personal and professional lives. And we're using a community-based method again that includes more junior and mid-career scholars from minority-serving institutions and predominantly white institutions as our research partners. So we're starting all over again using focus groups, interviews, and survey research. And we are in the process of now interviewing 100 Black faculty. So if you're interested in being interviewed, definitely let me know. So this is, again, the start of this project just launched last month. And so we'll be thinking about that relationship to what the narrations and the findings for the college project, how they look with faculty in our particular situation. So I'm going to stop there. So we have our full question and answer. But my conclusions are really that we're really just beginning to describe the African American experience in higher education in particular. So we want to think about how we can share this information and share this conversation. I like to think of Stanford not just as a high ranking or high research university, but in a Black-centered frame, how will we be a high resource university? Because really when we start that conversation, we're going to have academic, empirical, qualitative, quantitative, as my students in methods know right now, mixed method, community-centered ways of expressing the realist concept that we know, which is that Black Lives Matter. So thank you all so much. I look forward to y'all reading the full text. I look forward to our Q&A. And I think Jaylen's got some good questions for me. So I want to acknowledge my sponsors, particularly the National Science Foundation for this project and the University of California Historically Black College and University Initiative, as well as my co-authors, Mary Buckles from UC Santa Barbara, Christine Mallinson at UMBC, and the entire Talking College crew. Thank y'all so much.
All right, thank you, Professor Charity Hudley, for such a great talk. Always a pleasure. And I'll be monitoring the QA as we're going through, but I do have some prepared questions as we just alluded to. So until I get a good critical mass, I'll go through these questions that I prepared. All right, so my first question is about language practices shifting with time. So the context of that being Black children in California in particular are primarily served in increasingly linguistically diverse schools and communities. So when we think about Black language practices, how do you see those shifting with changing demographics?
I think it's a great question. I mean, it was really embodied, right, in some of our students and their multilingual, their multiracial identities, but also their different narratives of their experiences growing up and moving through California schools. And so I think what's really important for us is to think of capturing that range and maintaining that balance between thinking even practically just how we teach about African-American language and culture and identity and what it is, and listening to students as they develop those emerging identities, but still being aware of institutional racism, personalized racism, internalized racism, right? And so it's a really fine line between a student saying, I'm not really into this, I don't really, lead with Black culture, and thinking about how they got to that place. So we have to really lay out, I think, in this model with not just higher ed, but also with P-12 students, that range of options and understanding that your identity may develop and change over time. And because a lot of the students that we are seeing in the project, right, if you were getting to college, their education, sometimes even their lived experience, was a little contentious, even with how their parents told them to present, how the community was giving input back and forth. And the state-sanctioned anti-Blackness that we see in California, along with this kind of contact situation, meaning, students may be in more multicultural, more multilingual context, but affirmative action is real and it impacts Black students in a very specific way due to the California Master Plan and who goes where and who talks to whom in an educational sense, that I think we really have to hold those things in tension.
So I kind of want to follow up on a tension that you're raising there. On the one hand, we want to document and explain these nuanced practices so that people can better understand themselves and have the language to speak about what they're experiencing. But on the other hand, I can imagine that we'll have action researchers who want to take specific actions, some of which might go in a particular direction. They might want to, say, empower Black children or something like that. But there's a danger there, right? So there has to be space for people to express themselves and also for the researcher to sit with discomfort. So do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the way to sit with the discomfort is to sit with our own individual discomfort. We are making choices to present in this way at Stanford. Why are we doing that, right? Why am I choosing to present mostly in a standardized English form right now? And sometimes that is so that people can understand me. Like, we have to be honest with our own answers with students because they're gonna figure it out quickly. And I think in the linguistics literature, that aspect, which is what we're hoping to do next with the faculty, has kind of been glossed over. That everyday decision-making process, I think, is how we sit with the tension. And as we discover that ethnographically, I mean, your own work in thinking about naming practices, when we get into really thinking about not just the name your parents may have, or guardians may have given you, but the ones you choose to use, right? As a really, first step into thinking about how we as adults come into that decision-making process.
That's always a meaty one to think about.
Yeah.
So we had another question come in.
Yeah.
That's more of a clarification, historical question. So how has African-American language practices, how have they changed over the past 30 or so years?
Oh my goodness, I think that's a really great question. One of the things that we've really seen over the last 30 years is a change in language and context that, again, is not uniform, but the reality is that we have theoretically the ability to have more interactions with people from different backgrounds and groups, but an empirical reality that most Black people still have real structural constraints on where they live, where they attend school, who they're talking to every day. But we have a proliferation of language and culture in popular culture and media, but also in the internet that has brought Black language and culture in contact with other varieties. So not just in real space, but in virtual space. So the biggest changes we see along those lines are really thinking about our own ability to understand and connect with different people across the Black diaspora, but across the United States and African American diaspora. At the same time, that regionality on the local level, so kind of like your own accent, maybe some of the local lexical patterns, those are still there. And we don't have enough information. Sorry, I've dry mouth from my chemo. We don't have enough information right now to really say we can see just, oh, people are really speaking differently or they're signing differently, like overall, because that nuance is so ingrained and so specific and local, right? So when I listen to Black people, do I know if they're from California? Still a hard question to kind of, contextualize even 30 years. Jaylen and I may say, does Richmond, Birmingham, do they really sound different than 30 years ago? We're not really getting empirical data to say yes, because a lot of those conditions are actually still the same.
And you touched on diaspora in that question, and that ties to something I just got into the Q&A. So for context, so this attendee mentions for context that she is female, white, and that she's a Spanish teacher who learns Spanish as a second language, and that she strives to incorporate anti-racist practices into her teaching. She teaches heritage students, and you mentioned the heritage student model. And some of these students identify as Afro-Latinx. She is asking, does any of your research basically touch on this experience, touch on Afro-Latinx linguistic educational experience? And do you have any nuggets of wisdom that you'd like to share with this educator?
Yeah, we are now, well, we had Afro-Latinx scholar just kind of virtually enter our lab. Eris Clemens is an amazing scholar. She's at University of Tennessee, Knoxville. She was at University of Texas when we first met with her, whose work focuses on this question that you're asking, particularly in Dominican Spanish. And one of the things that she's really advocating for is the inclusion of more African diasporic linguistic models in Spanish classes, right? So the thing that she's saying is when Dominican students are going to school in New York and other places, and even I would say that, there's parallels out here, they're not learning about the full varieties of Spanish, just in the same way that when Black students are going to school, they're not learning about those full varieties. And what she's arguing with us now is we got to do both all at the same time. So Eris and I are actively writing together on that topic, creating models. She's really active in the Build and Broaden project. And we're thinking about how would that look, not just for students who are English or Spanish, educated because of their structural situation, but all of the varieties that are emerging in between in cities in Los Angeles, in New York, and all over the United States as different people come into contact. In my teaching, this has been an ongoing conversation, as many of my own students have been Afro-Latinx, but my classes will draw interest from African-American Latinx students, so the conversation is real. So you'll see some of that reflected in the text, but Eris takes that on head on as a matter of her work. So I invite you to check that out. And she is, as you might imagine, being so well-versed in this, she is from here in Palo Alto, born and raised. So there's a link to her website.
So that's Eris Clemens in Tennessee right now, right? Is that?
Yeah,
okay.
She's in Tennessee now.
So I have another question about or related to anti-racist tactics or practices. So as teachers develop rubrics for assignments with anti-racist tactics in mind, what do you believe is the key characteristic to keep in mind so that we're recognizing and encouraging different linguistic groups? I'll just ask it like that.
I think the key question to keep in mind is that linguistic flexibility needs to be part of that conversation, and that students have choice making that is inherent, and then there's also active. So they're still making choices even if they don't realize they're making choices. And so the more that we give them opportunities for that linguistic flexibility and for that meta-linguistic analysis, they will be able to be partners in the decision making. So they will say, look, okay, I want to change that. That's okay. Let's change that right now because this is the audience I'm trying to reach. And then other times they'll say, you know what? I don't want to change that. So let's leave that right here because I'm trying to reach a particular audience. And they can understand that linguistic flexibility. They can understand the ramifications developmentally as they go through school. But we open up that conversation. And our argument is that makes them better, more carefully attuned to language in general, and more carefully attuned to their own identity and also to their audience. So instead of like even just giving them contrastive analysis of choices, is adding that conversation in about those realities as part of the process and seeing how students react. And that's why we think our model is important, because students are going to react in very different ways. So we want to kind of be able to prepare for those different aspects.
So we're kind of coming toward the end. So I'll ask one slightly relevant question. If you feel like you can answer it quickly, then yes. Otherwise, maybe we can do a response after. So you were talking about the realities of things, and one of the attendees was asking how we overcome student and teachers' negative attitudes about African-American language and Black English.
Great. The thing that has worked the best for me, and this has been across the country now, is to build on our own linguistic empathy. So all of us have language variation. And so the first thing you want to do is establish that variation is part of language. Then what I do is really help educators to see how they may be connected themselves empathetically to people who speak different languages and different varieties. That gives me an entree then for thinking about African-American students, because we know the majority of our educators are not African-American. So I need to lay it on top of their own lived experience reality so that I can show how this variation parallels and augments their own language and their own experience. So I start from a place of not linguistic facts or examples, but that own sociolinguistic identity empathy, and build out from there. Sometimes that goes in, depending on the situation, that may build on those own educators' own sense of their language and their how they feel like they're being perceived linguistically. And then other times I really come from showing examples of African Americans who are using African American English and varieties in different ways, in literature, in professional context, right? That one, especially to get away from questions of, well, won't this damage later if they don't learn how to speak standardized English? How are they going to move through school? How are they going to move through jobs and professions? So when they like to use there are a lot of people who do a lot of professions who you can hear speak different languages and have different contexts, and we need that. We need people as Jaylen's doing, in artificial intelligence who have commands of African American English. We need people in hospitals who can work with patients who are coming in and need to really be able to communicate what's going on. So in that same vein, we need people in schools who are really, really fluent and ready to receive students so that learning can occur and doesn't just get blocked by linguistic variation or difference.
All right, thank you, ma'am. It seems like we're coming toward the end of time, end of the hour. So I'm gonna toss it back to Dr. Brown.
Thank you, Jaylen. Now, I can't close without Anne asking you one question. We have John Ball asking this question. There's nothing I would enjoy more than the conversation between the two of you. So John asked, is your research advocacy being swept up in the debates about critical race theory? So I'd love for you to close us out on that question.
I mean, it's gonna be, but as we say back in Virginia, I was born and raised in the briar patch, which means, dealing with racism, dealing with just in your face active racism is a matter of the course of justice. And I think what we're gonna do is make sure that our college students have access to information in different ways. We're gonna keep materials flowing. We're gonna really try to dialogue with people who want to understand and want to seek to understand. And the way we do that is breaking down walls of fear. The way that I was able to do most of my work was directly taking the fear on. It's actually the first part of my talk, dealing with the structural fears, dealing with those pressures, thinking about what we can do, really using old kind of civil rights and SNCC movement models. Where can we insert ourselves incrementally? And where do we need to take a stand and stand up for things that we know and believe in? And I think, different people are going to have different feelings about their own ability to do that, whether it's an educator in a school who says like, I can't, my educators back home say, I can't talk about race in my building. Okay, you may not talk about race in your building, but let's think about what we can do, to help and support you in the ways that make sense for you right now. And then you put pressure on people who really can take a stand against this backlash of critical race theory and say, you know what, y'all need to be also saying that this is what we can do. So part of my being here is like, I tell the pro-sem students on first day, we about to talk about critical race theory all through this class, and help people understand that, we are the ones that people have been waiting for.
Well said. Well said. So I want to thank you. The Dr. Ann Charity Hudley is one of a kind, and I really appreciate your wisdom here today. Thank you, Jaylen, as well. For the audience, we encourage you to join us for a special session. We're going to close out this quarter with a special session on Indigenous education. That's going to include Teresa McCarthy, Terry McCarthy, Tiffany Lee, and Stephanie Waterman, as well as Sheila Nicholas. So please join us. That's going to be in March 3rd. Thank you, everyone. And we look forward to future conversations with us, with the WILD community. Thank you for your presence today.